Sierra, and I'm also an Illinois State grad, so when you were talking, I was pretty excited. Go Redbirds.
Go Birds.
So as you can tell, we gave Sierra, Aaron, John, and Doug a really difficult task, which was share all of the depth and breadth of the knowledge that they have in 10 minutes or less in an hour webinar. And so I want to thank them for taking the challenge and providing a really great framework for today's conversation. And we really wanted to start with, okay, looking across the country, what did Doug find in his study about the different strategies states are implementing? And then dig a little bit more into those strategies where we could see what does that look like for Grow Your Own, for communities of practice, for financial incentive, for capacity building in different contexts. And then end up with really that practitioner perspective of what does this really look like and feel like in the classroom and in the community. And so it was very, very hard. Thank you guys all for doing that. We're going to spend like the next 10 minutes answering some questions that have come in the chat. And want to let you know to continue to put the questions in the chat box. What we can do is if there are a lot of questions that come in, we can try to answer some of those after today by email. So even if we don't get to your question in the Q&A, continue to submit the questions, and we'll try to get you that information. One of the questions that emerged, and this will be for anybody on the panel, is that has anyone heard of any teacher residency programs in any of the states that you work with that result in a teacher receiving a master's degree in rural education?
This is Doug Gagnon again. I have heard of a couple of residency type programs. The U.S. Department of Ed funds teacher residency grants from time to time. And sometimes they have a rural component to them, and they currently have RFP out for that right now. And I know there was a Cal State University at Bakersfield won a grant for this in which they paired with 3 different rural districts in the Central California Valley. And that was there's another question I saw about whether or not there's a cohort component to some of these rural teacher development type programs. And so this would be an example of both. I mean, I don't know, I don't think the master's degree is specifically, in rural education, but I assume that there's a kind of a component to their curriculum development that is trying to help teachers think about what's unique about teaching in rural schools. So, I'd recommend that the person that asked the question to check out that residency program at TSU Bakersfield.
There's one program, this is Tori. I don't believe it's a master's degree, but in Iowa, the Iowa Teacher Quality Partnership Grant was focused specifically on teacher residency programs in rural communities where they were trying to increase placement. I don't believe it had the master's degree component, but that might be another teacher residency program you could potentially take a look at. The next question, this probably won't be a surprise to anyone since ESSA is at the top of everybody's kind of list of what's going to happen and what are the regulations going to mean. So we had a question about, and again, this will be open for anyone, about what impact, if any, do you see ESSA having on teacher recruitment and retention in rural areas? And in particular, do you see any opportunities within ESSA? Again, knowing that the regulations are still being developed by the department, but what opportunities do you see to enhance recruitment and retention of effective teachers in rural areas?
I'd like to jump in with that one. This is John Alfords, but I think as an administrator that's going to be a really good thing because some rural high schools have been hard-pressed to offer all of the courses that they'd like to because of the highly qualified qualifications for teachers and have had to sometimes resort to distance learning as a result. And I think that will relieve some of that pressure. And also with the loosening of Title I requirements and enabling rural schools to use Title I funds in different ways, I think that's going to relieve some of the stresses in the rural school budgets too. So I see those as both positive developments.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Okay. Another question, and again, it's to everybody. So we talked a lot about these different strategies and what they might look like. What do we know about the effectiveness of each of those strategies? Or are these initiatives that are being implemented either too new to really see what the effective might be? And if so, what recommendations or what ideas do you guys have around measuring the effectiveness of those strategies?
Hi, this is Erin. I can jump in on that one. So with the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative, we've been working on this work for a fair amount of time. But I also say that, we're sort of at different phases of implementing different strategies. So with a lot of our funding streams, we also have an evaluation component. So there's an evaluation study that is coming out of TIF. We also have some evaluation work with the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative with the Straight A grant. In terms of sort of the early effectiveness and what are some things we're looking at on the TIF side, the TIF districts have seen an increase if using some of the different types of measures that are available to teachers around measuring student growth. So we did see an increase of teachers who had at least a year's worth of growth or more than a year's worth of growth on value added. We've also done a lot of sort of perception surveys amongst teachers around how much they value sort of the types of professional development and supports they're getting, and those have been very favorable. But I would say keep your eyes peeled for some of the studies that will be coming out as we're sort of wrapping up these initiatives. That's always a challenge, to try to figure out sort of the impact while you're doing things. On one of the other initiatives, as I mentioned, the dual enrollment component, an immediate outcome of the investment in credentialing teachers is that we've had more than doubling of the courses that are able to be offered, and students are able to access dual enrollment within participating districts. So what we're hopeful is that that's going to translate into students, actually getting all the way to a degree, earning more credentials, and an increase in college going and retention. But at least kind of based on the initial investment, we've definitely seen a change in terms of what's being offered to kids in terms of opportunity.
And Erin, there's one follow-up question to what you were talking about in terms of the coordinator position for the collaborative, the PD coordinator. There's a question on whether or not that is a paid position or is that a committee appointment.
So at this point, within the grant, it was the position. Each district, with the straight A funds, each district received an allocation. Professional development coordinators did receive a stipend initially, although that would, once the grant funds are through, the districts would have to sort of sustain that position and determine how they might want to incentivize that. But at least the initial training and the initial role was there was a stipend available through the grant. The selection was made by each district.
And Sierra, for you, there's a question about just how would you suggest helping homegrown teachers like yourself expand the experiences that they have beyond their hometown to help better prepare students for their post-secondary pathway, whatever that might be, whether they go to college or move into careers?
You know what, with being a homegrown teacher, what I think has been most helpful is your relationships and your friendships with other people. For me, luckily, because I just graduated 2 years ago, I still keep in contact with a lot of my peers that I went to college with. And I think they've been really helpful for me with being a homegrown teacher to kind of expand my horizons. I have many friends who are fifth grade teachers like myself, and I have many friends who are also art teachers. So a lot of times we can kind of talk to each other about curriculum and figure things out and share different resources we've found. So that I think has been probably the most helpful thing for me, was kind of expanding my horizons, being